The man did not knock. He stood in the rain outside Nell Harston's boarding house, with a boy pressed against his side and water running from the brim of his hat. And when she opened the door, he said only this: "The boy hasn't eaten since yesterday morning. Whatever you charge, I'll make good on it. But please feed him first." Nell had been running the boarding house alone for 2 years. She had learned in that time to read the difference between a man who was desperate and a man who was dangerous. This one held the boy's shoulder with the flat of his hand, not gripping, just steadying, and he looked at her face long enough to wait for an answer, then looked down at the boy while he waited. That was the thing she noticed first. He looked at the child before he looked at the door. "Come in," she said. The boy was perhaps 7 years old. He wore a coat 2 sizes too large, the sleeves turned up at the cuffs in careful folds that someone had pressed flat. His boots were dry. She understood then that the man had carried him across the muddy lane from the road. The boy did not speak when she spoke to him. He stood beside the man, one hand tucked inside the man's coat pocket, and watched her with dark, steady eyes. "What's his name?" Nell asked. "Finn." She set a bowl of potato soup on the table nearest the stove and pulled out the chair. Finn sat without being told. He wrapped both hands around the bowl the way a child does when they are very cold and not certain the warmth will last. The man stood near the door with his hat in his hands. He had not been invited to sit, and he did not sit. "Your name?" Nell asked. "Patrick Quill." She looked at him properly then. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, with a carpenter's hands, wide across the knuckles, scarred near the base of the thumb. His coat was mended at both elbows. His face was weathered, but not rough. There was a quietness about him that did not seem like shyness. It seemed like a man who had learned to take up only the space he needed. "Are you looking for a room, Mr. Quill, or just the meal?" "Work first," he said, "if there's any to be had." Nell had known since early September that the dock planking along the north side of the bay needed replacing before freeze-up. She had known since July that the root cellar wall was bowing inward from the wet summer. She had known since her husband Bernard died that the woodshed needed a new ridgepole and that the kitchen window frame had softened enough that it would not last anyone to fix any of it. She had known how to pay anyone to fix any of it. "Can you work wood?" "Yes." "Stone." "Enough." She looked at Finn, who had finished the soup and was pressing the back of his spoon gently into the bread she had placed beside the bowl. He was not eating quickly. He ate the way a child eats when someone has taught him that food is worth noticing. "There's a storage room off the kitchen," she said. "Small, but dry." Patrick nodded once. "That's more than enough." Later that evening, after Finn was asleep on the narrow cot she'd made up beside the storage shelves, Nell stood at the kitchen table and listened to the rain against the window glass. She had not planned for guests this late in the season. The last traveling boarder had left in September. She had planned to close the front rooms by November and live on what she had managed to save. She pulled her ledger close and studied the numbers she already knew by heart. Across the yard, Patrick had left one lantern burning in the woodshed. She could see its glow through the rain. At 10:30, it went out. He began before first light. She heard the ads before she heard anything else, a steady, careful rhythm from the direction of the dock. When she looked out the kitchen window with her first cup of tea, she could see him in the gray morning, crouched at the far end of the north plank, measuring the rot with his fingers before he cut. He had not asked her which boards were worst. He had walked the dock the evening before, in the last of the light, pressing each plank with his boot to find where it gave. By the time she had breakfast ready, he had replaced 4 boards and stacked the rotten ones neatly at the edge of the yard for burning. Finn appeared in the kitchen doorway while she was frying eggs. He had dressed himself, every button done up straight. He did not speak, but he came to stand beside the stove and watch the pan until she handed him the wooden spoon and let him stir. "Thank you," she said. He did not answer, but he kept stirring. She had not asked Patrick about Finn's silence. It was not her question to ask, but over the first few days she began to understand the shape of it. The way Patrick paused before giving an instruction, turned to face Finn directly, spoke with his hands when words weren't landing. He never pushed. He never filled the silence with noise. When Finn pointed at something, Patrick looked at what the boy was pointing at, and answered as if the gesture were language, because in their life together, it was. On the fourth day, Finn began following Nell through the house, the way he followed Patrick through the yard. He carried kindling from the box to the stove. He folded the clean towels she pulled from the rack and stacked them on the shelf near the washroom door. He could not reach the top shelf, so he looked at her until she lifted the towels up for him, and then he looked satisfied. She fed him first at every meal. He stopped looking surprised by the third day. Greystone Landing was not a large town. The post road ran along Georgian Bay for half a mile, and everything the town needed sat within easy walking distance of it. The mill, the feed store, the church, and Percy Dunne's mercantile, which also served as the post office, the informal bank, and the clearinghouse for most of the local news. Percy had been patient about Nell's mortgage note for 14 months. He had been patient in the way that men are patient when they believe the outcome is already decided and time is working in their favor. The boarding house sat on a good quarter-acre of waterfront property. He had spoken to her twice about buying it outright. Both times, she had thanked him and declined. He rode in on a Tuesday morning, tied his horse at the post, and let himself through the gate, without waiting for an invitation. Patrick was at the root cellar, relaying the fieldstone on the east wall, where the ground had heaved and bowed the old mortar loose. Nell was in the kitchen, marking her flour and coal supplies in the ledger. Percy stepped up onto the porch and knocked twice, then opened the door before she could cross the room. "I heard you took on a laborer," he said. "I hired a handyman." Nell closed the ledger. "There's a difference." Percy looked past her into the kitchen. Finn was sitting at the corner of the table with a length of pine board in his lap, turning it slowly in his hands. He had found the board beneath the storage shelf, along with a small draw knife and a roughing gouge, Bernard's tools, unused since he died. The board was the beginning of something Bernard had started and never finished: a rocking chair, the curved seat rail, rough cut but not shaped. Percy looked at the boy, then back at Nell. "Same man who came in with the mute child." "The boy's name is Finn," Nell said. Percy moved to look through the kitchen window toward the root cellar. Patrick's back was to them, but his shoulders had gone still. He had heard the horse arrive. "I have a surveyor coming from Midland next week," Percy said, keeping his voice pleasant, "just to set the boundary lines clear on the waterfront lots." A boarding house this close to the dock, with a stranger, doing unlicensed structural work. The township could take an interest. Nell set her pen down. "The work is licensed through me as the property owner." "A widow running a boarding house on a mortgaged lot," Percy said, "with a drifter and a child sleeping in the back room." He gave a small smile. "People talk, Nell." At the root cellar, Patrick set down his trowel, stood, and turned around. He did not raise his voice. "The east cellar wall was bowing 6 inches, he said, clearly enough to carry across the yard. If it had gone through the winter, it would have taken the kitchen floor with it come the spring thaw. The dock planking on the north side had rot in 8 boards. I replaced 11, because the ones adjacent to the rot were soft enough that they would have followed before June." He paused. "If the surveyor wants to examine the work, he's welcome to." Percy turned to face him fully. His smile thinned. "A drifter's word on structural work isn't worth much in a township office." "Then bring the surveyor," Patrick said. "I'll show him the load calculations." Percy looked back at Nell. I'm offering fair market on this property. You'd walk away with enough to rent something comfortable in town. Think about it seriously this time." After he left, Nell stood at the kitchen window for a long moment without speaking. Finn had gone back to turning the board in his hands, running his thumb along the rough-cut curve. "He's been patient a long time," she said, mostly to herself. Patrick came through the kitchen door, his hands chalky from the mortar. He looked at Finn and the board, then at Nell. "How much does he hold on the note?" She told him the number. He did not wince. "What does the property bring in a good summer?" She told him that number too. He was quiet a moment, the way he was quiet when he was measuring something. "Then it earns itself twice over in 4 seasons," he said. "He's not offering fair market. He's offering what he figures you'll take because you're tired." Nell looked at him. No one had said that plainly to her before, though she had known it. "1 season won't settle the note," she said. "No," Patrick agreed, "but 2 might." The weather turned the last week of October. It came in from Georgian Bay the way autumn storms always did. A warm front driving hard from the southwest, colliding with the cold that had been sitting over the shield since mid-month. Rain began on a Wednesday and did not stop. By Thursday noon, the river that fed the bay from the east had risen 2 feet above its late-season mark. By Thursday evening, it was still climbing. The dock held. Patrick had seen to that. But below the boarding house, on the low ground near the bay, the water was creeping toward the storage shed where Nell kept her winter fuel. The coal she'd bought in September, the split hardwood that had to last until March. If the shed flooded, she would lose it all. She did not have money to replace it. Patrick saw the danger at the same moment she did. They worked through the evening together, stacking sandbags along the shed's east wall. The neighbor's son, a young man named Alec who had seen the lanterns moving in the rain, came over without being asked. Between the 3 of them, they built a barrier along the low side of the yard by 8:30. Before he went out to check the barrier a final time, Patrick came into the kitchen and crouched in front of Finn. "You stay here by the window," he said, calm as though the rain weren't hammering the glass behind him. "Keep the lamp burning on the sill. If you see the light go out in the yard, you go straight to the upstairs room and you wait until I come for you or Nell comes for you. Nobody else." Finn looked at him. Then he looked at Nell. "He means it," she said quietly. Finn picked up the lamp and carried it to the windowsill with both hands. He set it down carefully, adjusted the wick until the flame burned even, and stood back. Then he looked at Patrick. Patrick put his hand briefly on the boy's shoulder. "Good man." He went back out into the rain. Nell followed. Near midnight, the eastern barrier held, but the water found another way. A low point on the north side of the shed they hadn't sandbagged because it had looked sound in the dark. A thin sheet of black water was moving across the floor toward the coal stack. Patrick went in and started moving the bottom layer of coal to the high shelf along the back wall. Nell worked beside him with the flat spade, both of them working without speaking because there was nothing useful to say. 40 minutes of cold and dark and wet, the sound of the bay surging beyond the yard. And when they finally came out, the water was ankle-deep at the shed door, but had not touched the stack. They stood in the rain in silence for a moment. "It'll subside by morning," Patrick said. Nell looked toward the kitchen window. The lamp was still burning on the sill, small and steady behind the glass. "He kept it," she said. Inside, Finn was standing at the window with his palms flat against the glass, watching the yard. When he saw them cross the lane, something in his face shifted. Not the careful stillness she had come to know, but something open. Something that had been held very tight for a long time, and was now, cautiously, beginning to loosen. Patrick came through the door. He pulled it shut against the wind. Water dripped from his coat onto the kitchen floor. And then Finn said, in a voice rough from long disuse, barely above a whisper, You came back." The kitchen went still. Patrick stood at the door with his hands still on the latch. He did not move for a moment. "I came back," he said. That was all. No one made a fuss of it. But Nell turned toward the stove before her face could show too much, and she kept her back to them both until the kettle was on, and she was reasonably certain she could speak, without her voice breaking. Behind her, she heard Patrick cross the kitchen. She heard the quiet sound of Finn's coat being unbuttoned, then the scrape of a chair, as Patrick sat the boy down near the stove to warm. By the next morning, the water had begun to retreat. The bay was still high, and the lane to the road was a river of brown mud. But the yard was clear. The shed had held. Percy Dunne's lower lot had not. His storage barn, which he had built on the flat ground below the road 7 years ago, sat in 8 inches of standing water. The winter hay he'd bought in August was ruined. The new harness stored along the north wall was ruined. 3 of his 4 bottom bins of seed grain were ruined. His property sat lower than Nell's. He had always known that it sat lower. He had simply never built the drainage barriers to address it, because addressing problems on his own land had seemed less urgent than acquiring other people's. The township road inspector came through that afternoon to document the flood damage along the Bay Road. He stopped at Nell's property, looked at the sandbag barrier along the east wall, walked the dock, pressed the new planking with his boot heel, and asked who had done the work. Nell told him. He noted it in his ledger. He noted the held shed, the undamaged dock, the new cellar wall visible through the open hatch. 2 hours later, Percy Dunne arrived with the road inspector still on the property. Percy had come to make his offer again on the boarding house. With his own stock ruined, he needed the waterfront property more urgently now than he had before the storm. He found the inspector crouching at the waterline on the dock, asking Patrick about the notching technique on the new joinery. Percy waited. Eventually, the inspector stood, shook Patrick's hand, and walked back toward the road, still making notes. Percy looked at Nell. "I'll go 400 above my last offer." "I'm not selling," Nell said. "Nell, be reasonable. A woman alone running this on a note." "Her shed held," said a voice from the gate. They both turned. It was Hilda Scarth, who was 63 years old, and had lived on the Bay Road since before Percy Dunne's father was born. She had her arms crossed and her eyes on Percy with the expression of a woman who has heard enough. "My woodpile is 3 feet from her shed wall," Hilda said, coming through the gate without invitation. "Her shed held. My woodpile is dry. I'd say I owe the man a decent meal, not a complaint filed at the township office." She looked at Patrick without warmth, but without suspicion either, the frank look of a practical woman assessing a fact she intends to remember. Percy looked between them. He looked at Nell's ledger, open on the porch table from the morning's figures. He looked at the dock, the shed, the repaired cellar hatch. He left without making another offer. 3 days after the flood, Nell found the rocking chair finished. She had not asked Patrick to work on it. She had not even mentioned that she knew what it was. That Bernard had roughed out the seat rail, the winter before he took ill, intending to finish it in the spring, and then hadn't. She had kept it under the storage shelf for 2 years, because she could not bear to burn it, and didn't know how to finish it herself. It sat now in the corner of the kitchen, near the stove. The seat rail had been shaped and sanded smooth. The back spindles were new, cut from leftover dockwood fitted carefully to match the original posts. The runners were even. The whole chair was balanced. Nothing about it was ornate, but nothing about it was careless either. Finn was sitting in it. He was not rocking. He had both feet flat on the floor and the pine board from the storage shelf in his lap, and he was tracing something on it, with a nail, pressing lightly, just enough to leave a mark. Nell stood in the doorway with the feed pail in her hand, and looked at the chair for a long moment. When she could speak, she asked, "Who finished it?" Finn looked up. He looked toward the yard, where Patrick was splitting wood at the block. Nell set the feed pail down and walked to the chair. She put her hand on the back rail and felt the smoothness of the sanding, the care in the joinery. Bernard had started this chair for her. He had roughed the form from a picture she'd shown him in a library magazine from Midland. A chair with a high back and shaped spindles, something she had thought was too fine for their plain kitchen. He had said nothing was too fine for their kitchen. And he had started cutting the wood the following week. She pressed the back rail once, gently. "The spindles match," she said. Not to Finn, not to anyone, just the fact of it spoken aloud. That evening, she placed a folded paper on the kitchen table beside Patrick's coffee cup. He looked at it but did not reach for it until she nodded. "It's a working agreement," she said. "A share of the summer boarding income in exchange for maintenance work through the season. Full say over structural repairs and winter preparation." She paused. "And the storage room for as long as you need it." Patrick read the first page slowly. His hands were still cracked at the knuckles from the cold work of the flood, and he turned the pages carefully. Finn sat at the table with a cup of warm milk, watching his father's face the way children watch the faces of the people they love most when the stakes are unclear. Patrick stopped at the third paragraph. He read it again. The third paragraph said, "Finn Quill is welcome in this house without condition or term, for as long as his father holds this agreement, or for as long as Finn himself wishes to remain." Patrick set the paper down. His jaw tightened. "You don't owe him that," he said. "No," Nell said, "I don't." The stove ticked between them. Outside, the bay made its usual sound against the dock. The low, steady press of water that had been there every night since she had moved into this house as a bride of 22. "Bernard wanted to board children," she said after a moment. "From the start, he thought the summer ones. The ones the city family sent up, he thought they needed somewhere they could come back to. We never got around to it." She looked at the rocking chair in the corner. "He got around to things slowly." Patrick was quiet. "Finn helped me count the flour tins yesterday," Nell said. "He put them in order by size without being asked. He set them all facing the same way." A pause. "He set 2 cups out this morning, before I was up, on the right side of the saucers." Patrick looked at his son. Finn looked back at him, steady and still in the way that had always been his nature. But there was something in his expression now that had not been there before. Something that looked, tentatively and carefully, like belonging. Patrick reached for the pen she had left beside the inkwell. He held it for a moment, without writing. "I won't take what someone else built," he said. "You're not taking it," Nell said. "You're helping me carry it forward." He wrote his name. Slowly, because the cracked knuckles made the grip difficult. But he wrote it clearly, every letter. Not as a hired hand, not as a man receiving charity, as a man who had been offered a place on honest terms and had accepted it honestly. Winter settled over Greystone Landing the way Georgian Bay winters always did. Not gradually, but all at once. The first real snow coming off the water overnight, and leaving the dock white and the bay the color of iron by morning. Nell kept the week's accounts in her ledger. There were no summer boarders now. Only the 2 of them, and Finn, and Hilda Scarth, who had decided without any formal arrangement that she preferred supper with company rather than alone, and had become a steady presence at the kitchen table. Finn drew in the margins of Nell's ledger when she let him. Small things, a dock, a shed, a chair with curved runners. One afternoon she found a drawing she had not seen him make. 4 figures standing in front of a house. 2 tall, 2 small. She studied it for a moment before she understood that the second small figure was not a child. It was a woman, smaller than the others, set apart and slightly above. "Who is that one?" she asked. Finn considered the drawing. "Mama," he said. "She likes houses with lights in the windows." Nell set her pen down. She looked out across the bay, white now under the new snow, the dock boards dark against it. "Then we'd better keep the lamp in the window," she said. Finn nodded, entirely serious. He picked up the pencil and drew a lamp in the window of the house, its small flame carefully rendered in 3 short strokes. Percy Dunne had hired a drainage man from Barry in November to deal with the flooding on his lower lot. The man had told him what Patrick could have told him in September. The barn needed to sit 3 feet higher, and the north side needed a proper French drain run down to the ditch. It would cost him twice what it might have cost before the storm, and the barn would be out of use until spring. Hilda mentioned this at supper one evening, not unkindly, simply as information. Patrick said nothing. Nell kept writing in her ledger. "The drainage would have been the same work either way," she said, without looking up. "He just didn't want to hear it until the water made the argument for him." On the last Saturday before Christmas, Finn walked to the dock with a small tin of lamp oil in both hands. He had noticed that morning, when Patrick checked it aloud, that the dock lamp was running low. He had found the oil tin himself on the woodshed shelf and carried it down without being asked. Patrick crossed the yard to meet him. He wore the wool scarf Nell had knitted during the evenings while his hands were healing. She had left it on the storage room door handle one morning without saying a word. He had worn it every cold day since. Finn held up the tin. Patrick took it, and they walked together down to the dock. Finn held the lamp steady while Patrick filled it, then watched while Patrick set the glass back in place and struck the match. The flame took and steadied in the still, cold air. "It'll carry across the water," Finn said. "That's what it's for," Patrick said. They walked back up the lane together. At the top, the boarding house door stood open, warm light falling out across the snow. Nell was in the doorway with her ledger under one arm. When Patrick reached the step, she did not move aside entirely. She made room, but kept her hand on the doorframe. "Supper's ready," she said. Patrick looked at Finn, then at her. Something crossed his face that he made no effort to hide. A quietness that was not the quietness of a man keeping his distance, but the quietness of a man who has finally come to rest somewhere that fits. "We're coming," he said. Finn went through first. He went directly to the kitchen table and set 3 plates without being asked, the way he had been doing for 3 weeks, as naturally as breathing, as if the number 3 had always made sense to him. The door closed behind them. Outside, the bay wind came across the ice and tried the dock lamp. The flame bent but did not go out. Greystone Landing's boarding house did not survive that winter, because the season was mild, or because fortune was kind. It survived because every weak place had been found and strengthened before the cold could find it first. The dock, the cellar wall, the fuel shed, the gate latch that Patrick had noticed and fixed one evening in October without saying a word about it, and the lamp on the windowsill that Finn had kept burning through the worst night of the year. Patrick Quill came to the door, asking for a meal. Nell Harston fed his son first. And in doing so, she gave them both more than a room, more than wages, more than shelter from a Georgian Bay winter. She gave them a house where the lamp stayed lit. And so did they. Thank you for listening to this story all the way to the end. If it moved you, please like and share. It helps these tales reach the people who need them. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And before you go, I'd love to know, what would you rate this story from 0 to 10? Leave your number where in Canada or anywhere in the world you're watching from. I'll see you in the next tale.